Flying is magical. I know because I have worked with just over 100 airlines in the last 15 years, and yet the one flight I remembered is my first flight. I was 11 and a half years old, flying from New Delhi to Singapore on an old Aeroflot Illusion aircraft. It was an overnight flight, yet I looked out of the window the entire flight. Guess what? My daughter did the same thing on her first flight. She was 2.5. We were flying from Toronto, where we lived, to Halifax. And she's looking out of the window, and she goes, "Dad, look, a green tail. Dad, a maple leaf on a tail." As we take off, she catches the first glimpse of Lake Ontario, and she's looking, "Dad, it's huge. It's not a lake, it's an ocean." As we continue, we climb further and we climb over CN Tower, which was by then the tallest thing she had seen in her life. And she goes, "Dad, I'm actually taller than CN Tower. This is amazing." And she's looking out of the window, putting stickers on the window, playing her game for the 2-hour flight. And as we descend over the forests of Nova Scotia, she goes, "Dad, I think I saw a bear." When we land, I remember seeing sparkle in her eyes. And that is the magic of flying. You would think travel is growing. Indeed, travel is growing. Today, there are 29,000 airplanes in the air on any given day. By 2050, there will be 42,000 airplanes in the air at any time. Travel is growing. But that also has a side effect. Airplanes pollute. Today, aviation's CO2 emissions as part of global emissions are just about 2 to 3% globally. But in 2050, because of this growth, that will rise to 22% of global emissions. Just let that sink in. By 2050, aviation's total CO2 emissions will grow tenfold to almost a quarter of humanity's emissions. Planes pollute, smoking kills. On that flight in 1994, smoking was allowed. When I got off at Singapore Changi Airport, I was smelling like a cigarette. Today, you can't imagine smoking on a flight. In fact, you must imagine smoking indoors in most places as well. Smoking today is a social taboo. I'm concerned that by 2050, flying may become a social taboo if it is responsible for 25% of society's emissions. We have to do something because aviation has been so critical to humanity's progress. When the Wright brothers flew for the first time, they were specifically looking at an engineering marvel. It continued to become an engineering marvel all the way till the Concorde broke the speed barrier, the sound barrier. Today, the founders of Zoom, Tesla, the CEOs of Google, Adobe, all of these guys, inventors of the mRNA vaccines, would not have been able to do their work had they not been able to migrate to the countries that they're working in. Flying is critical for business, for connecting cultures, for making the world a smaller place. We have to save aviation to save humanity. How do we do it? Well, let me share a story of Anders Forslund. Anders Forslund was walking down Swedish Parliament across him in 2018 on a crisp January morning. And he saw a teenager holding a board who was sitting in her school uniform protesting for saving the climate. That same teenager, a year later, decided to avoid flying and take a boat across the Atlantic to give a speech at the UN. She was named in 2019 as the Time Person of the Year. I am talking about Greta Thunberg. In 2019, 1 year later, after this incident, Anders sat down with his wife to design the world's first hybrid electric aircraft with the same mission as Greta, but working towards solution and not necessarily protesting about it. Anders and Clara drew on the back of a napkin their design and vision for what an electric plane could look like. Where would the batteries go? How would it take off and land? They presented this to the executives at SAS Scandinavian Airlines, and they said, oh, this is interesting. Let me give you a letter of intent. They did the same thing with 4 other airlines, took 4 letters of intent, flew over to the US, and got investment from the legendary investor Chris Saka. They came back, used this investment to hire a hangar. For 1 whole year, they sat in one corner of this hangar, refining their designs on a computer. And then it was time to make this a reality, for which they needed an engineer who had built an airplane and sold it too. Their global search led them to Brazil. Brazil is home to Embraer, one of the top 3 airplane manufacturers. They did find not just a person to be their head of engineering, they found 24 engineers who had just finished designing an airplane and were looking for the next challenge. So you have these 25 Brazilians who were surfing one day on the shores of Florianopolis, learning to ski on the slopes of Gothenburg 2 weeks later. You might not be surprised if you hear Portuguese in Gothenburg these days, because they are a big force to deal with these days. Guess what? These engineers come in and they tell Anders and Tara, nice drawing, but we'll have to redo it. In the end, they designed what is called the Heart Aerospace ES-30, a 30-seater electric aircraft, which till date has closed over 100 orders, all the way from SAS Scandinavian Airlines to Air Canada. The airline sold their first tickets for a flight in 2028, and the tickets were sold out in an hour. For a flight in 2028, which will be the world's first electric flight. So not only will you be flying regionally on electric airplanes, you will be flying short-haul to medium-haul on hydrogen planes. There are airports like Bristol and Eindhoven working on it, companies like Zero Avia already testing flights in the Cotswold with hydrogen aircraft. There is sustainable aviation fuels that is going to be prominent because of these 42,000 airplanes. They'll be built using today's technology, and that will fly on sustainable aviation fuels where overall CO2 emissions can be reduced by 80%. But there's one more question I need to answer. Who are we saving aviation from? I told you how to save aviation. Who are we saving it from? In my experience working with the industry, we need to save aviation from itself. The biggest thing we need to change is the mindset of the executives. We should not be producing airplanes and just launching flights just because you can, just because you can buy a cheap plane. We don't need to grow at all costs. We have to grow sustainably. So aviation executives should be taking simple actions like, hey, I'm a CEO of a small airline. My next job should not be the CEO of a big airline and launch the 10th daily flight from London to Disneyland. Instead, I should be thinking about, I'm an airline CEO, I've got 15 years experience, let me go join Heart Aerospace and their board and help them scale electric airplanes into aviation. Let me go join Zero Avia as a chief commercial officer and help them scale this hydrogen aircraft because I know the airline industry. Not only that, I would love for airlines and aviation executives to think about implementing a polluter pays tax, where frequent flyers can start paying up to 10% of their flight cost towards a sustainable aviation fuel purchase or towards a clean skies fund that funds more innovations in sustainability. Many people in the industry think, oh, implementing taxes is hard. But do you know that the typical airport departure tax in the UK today, which goes in the bottomless pit called the government coffers, if that is set aside, that can cover the entire country's sustainable aviation fuel mandate based on what is being collected today. It can be done. And that's what the executives should do. What can we do as individuals? Well, have you heard of the term called workation? It's when you combine a leisure trip with a work trip. It's something I have done personally for the last 3 years. I have to go fly for a work trip. I stay there for 2 days, and I bring the family along, and we take a week-long holiday. You cut your flights like that. You try to not sort by price and take a multi-hop flight. Try to fly non-stop. Yes, you might pay a bit more, but your carbon emissions will reduce because an airplane burns the most CO2 at takeoff and at landing. So if you avoid 2 or 3 stops, just fly non-stop, it will help. Use search engines like Google Flight, where you can sort by CO2 emissions and book the flight with the least emissions. Or fly an airline like United, which allows you to see the CO2 emissions before you book the flight, based on how old or new the aircraft type is. Trust me, I've done this, and me being in the aviation industry, I flew 75 flights a year a few years ago. I cut that down to 45 flights a year just before the pandemic, and last year I flew 15 flights in total. So this can be done, because today, only 4% of global humanity has ever stepped on an international flight. We need to spread the benefits of flying to the rest of the world as well. Because there's not a single week that goes by where I don't meet someone who has benefited from the magic of flying. Last week, I met Angus. Angus is an Englishman with a very thick accent which I could barely understand. But Angus, I met him at Lakshmi Puja, which is a Bengali festival ahead of Diwali, Hindu festival. And Angus was making jhalmuri, which is a traditional Indian street food. I could barely believe my eyes. He was making it. And I had to ask him, Angus, what in the world are you doing and how did you learn this? He was making it like you would see it on the streets of Delhi or Calcutta. His story just left me stunned. It was 2003. He was flying the cheapest way to Brisbane, which required a 28-hour stopover in Calcutta. So he gets out of the airport, he goes out, and it is the day of Lakshmi Puja, which is a huge festival, and the streets are lined up with street vendors, with street side food. He's so fascinated that he tries one of them, and that was jhalmuri. And his head is hit with a riot of flavors, and his color everywhere, and sounds and music. If anyone has been to India, it's an overload on the senses. He fell in love with it. He took that flight every year via Calcutta, trying the multiple street foods. He's not a filmmaker, but he ended up making a documentary on Indian street food, fell in love with the food, and learned how to do it himself. Today, you will find Angus at the various street markets around London and the UK, making jhalmuri for all of us. That is the magic of flying that we must preserve, because had Angus not been forced into this Calcutta stopover, he would not have been this Englishman serving a traditional street-side Indian food, which I personally had 5-6 years ago, the last time, until last week, being served by an Englishman. And that is the magic of flying. We must save aviation to save humanity. Thank you.